Okay, so when you first insert a 360-degree image, add a couple markers, don't do anything else, this is what you get. You get the markers, you have this pulsing animation to show that the markers haven't yet been visited. You can click any one of them. You can see your progress down here in the bottom. But there is no way to know when all of these have been visited. Even though we show a selected state and we actually do track visited, it's not revealed to us in terms of triggers. So we need to work with what we have, and we have quite a few ways to achieve this. So we'll work from this starting point and see what we can do both with triggers as well as with some variables. So I'm going to pop over here into Storyline. Let's just open up this default slide. Now, the only thing I've added to the slides here, so we can disable that timeline next button, the player next button when we start, is added a trigger that says when the timeline starts on this slide, go ahead and change the state of the next button, that's the player's next button, to disabled. So we have that on all slides because the idea here is we want to ensure the learner views or clicks all items before they're able to move forward. So if I edit this image, we've added 3 markers to the image, and you can see each of the markers over here on the side. We're not doing anything different with the navigation or the progress. But if I look at the triggers, there's no way for us currently to evaluate which markers have been clicked. So if I look at my available actions, I can show layers, and layers would be not here on the 360-degree image, but it would be on the actual slide right above this image, which is on the base layer. So we have some basic navigation and common triggers that we would expect to see, as well as some variables, but we don't have a way to evaluate when the states are changed like we do with other interactive objects on the slide layer. So with this first example, we're going to change the interaction type to the guided tour. Now, the benefit to the guided tour is that the learners will be stepped through each of the markers or hotspots in sequential order. And that order is determined by over here by what you see on the left side. So if I were to take any of these and move these forward or to the top, then in this case, even though this marker is off here on the right, this next slide marker is the first marker that we'll see. I'm going to keep that to the bottom because what we want to use for this particular marker is we want to add that trigger that says when you click this, jump to the next slide, and you can see that right here. So let's go ahead and just preview what this one looks like real quick. So first off, notice that the next button is still being disabled. And what we have here is a guided tour with 4 markers. We click the first one to begin. We can step through the markers using these arrows down below. And when I get to that 4th marker, it's a different color. It has the forward icon. Notice that my next button still doesn't show down below, but when I click the marker, we can then proceed to the next slide. Now, what we did here to ensure that the marker is clicked is we set it up so that all of these labels are turned off. So there are no labels. Because if we had the label showing, then the label is automatically going to fire when we get to this marker, and it would automatically jump to the next slide. Now, we are adding some tooltips that'll come with these markers in a future update, so that could help indicate to the learner that they need to click the button to continue. But this is a really simple way to let the learners click to move forward by just adding that trigger to jump to the next slide and add it to the last marker, whichever last marker you have in your list, to jump the learner forward. But they can't get to that last marker because we've set this up as the guided tour. So that's probably the simplest way to ensure the learner visits all of the markers before moving forward. All right, I'll go ahead and save and close right here. Next up, we're going to do something similar. We're going to keep it in the set to guided tour, but this time we're going to show a completion layer that indicates the learner has completed all of the markers, and then here's where we can show our next button. And then we can also add a slide layer trigger that also changes the player next button to normal. So as soon as the timeline starts on this layer, go ahead and change that next button on the player to normal. Let's open up our image and see what we have for this one. So most of the same. We have our first marker, we have a label on it. You can see there's a label on the second marker, third, and then on the 4th, we don't have the label, but when they click the marker, they're going to show the layer. Now, this layer isn't on the current image, it's on the slide itself. So it's just like working with any other show layer type trigger. It's working because this image is on the base layer. It'll show whichever layer you tell it to show. So we're saying show layer complete when the learner clicks this button. So let's go ahead and just see what that looks like right here. So that's the one we're on because we just moved forward from the previous example. So we'll click to begin. There's marker 1, marker 2, marker 3, and then we get to the marker 4. It automatically fires. Now, why did it do that? It automatically fired because we have the labels, and when the labels are displayed, there's a click associated with it. So as soon as we get to that 4th and final marker, that next button, when it's set to the guided tour, will activate or fire and then perform whatever actions you set with that. So we click the next button, and notice down here though, for the first time, our next button is actually visible. And that's because we have a slide layer trigger that's also allowing the learner to move forward. I think it's a good idea, at least in this case, the way we set it up here, to add the button for the next, because they may not notice that the next button down below hadn't been changed from the disabled state to the next. Now, let's take a look at what we can do similar to this, but not show a prompt. Call this more of a silent approach, and that is really the same technique we just showed, but the layer will automatically appear and there's no graphics on it. So when the layer appears, the learner's not going to see anything different, but we are going to leave the timeline starts for that next button on the change this next button to normal, and so it'll just happen quietly down below. So let's preview this one and see what that looks like. So I'll come in here. So it's really the same interaction, but we won't get any kind of prompt for moving forward. So next slide could indicate with the description, go ahead and click the next button on the player to move forward. And so it's not happening here with the button, but it is happening down here on the player. And this may feel a little bit more intuitive for the learner because the labels are all displaying the same, and then we have quietly enabled the next button below. So there are just a couple ways that you can work with the guided tour to ensure learners view all, right? So the key is, let me pull this open, right? The key is that the trigger, whether to show a slide layer, whether to jump to the next slide, is set to the very last marker or hotspot in your list. The guided tour ensures that you will follow these sequentially. Now, real quick, marker 1, marker 2, and all these, the numbers don't mean anything. I could start with marker 3 and make marker 1 my last marker. Storyline's going to look at this as a list from top to bottom. So just keep that in mind when you're working with this list. Okay, now let's take a look at working with variables to track and enable buttons based on clicking all of the markers. And if you've never worked with variables, this might be the time that you really want to get excited about them, because variables combined with the 360-degree image interaction gives you a lot of new possibilities, ways to really expand what the 360-degree images offer. Now, the good news is you can actually use the variable that's automatically created for you by Storyline when you add a 360-degree image. I'm going to pop open the variables right here for the project, and you're going to see quite a few variables. And this could be a little different if you are brand new to variables. So instead, I'm going to open up real quick a single file project so we can see what you get each time you add a 360-degree image. Okay, so here's what it looks like when you have only one image in your project. I have a single slide here and just a single 360-degree image. If I open up my project variables again, you'll see you have two variables that are automatically created. And this isn't unlike when you add a slider or a dial or a text entry field. Storyline's going to take care of part of that variable creation process for you. Storyline adds a variable. In this case, Storyline adds two different variables. One for the two variables for the same image. One is total items and visited items. So Storyline's actually tracking the visited items. So in our examples, we've been working with 3 markers. Well, that total then would be 3 items total, and then we're going to track when visited items, when this value, it's a number variable, when it equals 3, enable the next button, show me something, do something, right? So we know that we can make things happen when this variable has been adjusted or changed to a different value. Now, we can't we can't edit this value. We can't add numbers to it or values to it, but we can read it. And all we need to do is read it to make things happen. So I'm going to cancel out of there, and let's go back into our project file. And I'm on slide 3.1. But if I look at my project variables, there's really nothing here that's telling me which of these variables I need to use. So that's could be a little tricky, but thankfully Storyline has what's called a use count, and the use count is going to tell you where each variable has been used. Now, each of these is being used just one time because I haven't done anything in terms of reading or showing reference values. But when I get to the 4, right, if I click that, I can see that this is being referenced by the 360-degree image on slide 3.1. So that's how I can find where each of those values, which of the variables is being used on each of these slides. So that could take a couple moments if you have a ton of images. That would be something you'd have to just go and use that use count to find. So what I'm doing right here, this value right here is what's called the reference value. It's going to show you the value of the variable. And the way we add those is just adding a text box to the slide. And there's my blinking text box. Don't click away from it. Keep that blinking. And go back up to insert and reference. And we just need to find whichever value we want to display. We're just going to show the value of that variable. Now I know that I'm working with the image for visited and visited right there. So I select it, add it, and of course, I mean, it's the same thing I just used. If I format that with the dark and then make that light, right? So it'll change as we start to click each of the items. So I don't need 2 of these on the slide, but that's how you can display a variable's value. That's huge. Whether or not you're going to show this to the learner, probably aren't. But for me, testing this, I need that to verify things are working as intended. So let's take a look at how this one works. So this is our first variable. Now I have the reference down here. It's 0 because that's the default value. As I click each one of these, notice how it's counting here for me. Storyline's counting them right here. That's why Storyline's using that variable. 1 of 3 is visited of total. However, I want to read that value so I can make things happen when that value equals 3. And so I just clicked it, and then notice my next button just enabled. I don't know if you saw that. Let's try that again real quick. Notice the next button will be disabled as soon as we load the slide. Right now down here, it's not showing. It's disabled. I can't go forward. I want to go. So I just click these. Won't matter which order because we're tracking visited. But upon clicking that third, we can now move forward and next. So here's how we set that up. I'm going to open up 360-degree image. And what's happening for each of these triggers? Nothing. Why? Because it's already happening. There's nothing for you to do in terms of triggers or variables because all you're doing is tracking when these are visited. Storyline's managing this all for you. So again, if you're brand new to variables, this is something new, this is probably the way to go because you can make other things happen as well. Things like slide layers and other things going to pop up and show. So nothing to do here except for reading the value of the visited items for the specific image that you are using. Now let's take a look at some things you can do using your own custom variables. So in this case, you see that I have 3 variables that I've created. Well, maybe you don't know that I created them. I'll show them to you in a moment, but these are the same type of reference variable, the variable reference that we're using that we used previously to track the built-in variables, the variables that Storyline created for you, but now we're going to track and really watch and verify that Storyline's working for the variables that we created. So I have 3 markers in each case. Let's go ahead and pop open our image. And there are 3 variables that have been created called complete marker 1, complete marker 2, and then complete marker 3. So in the variables window, I created those 3 variables. Why does that keep opening right there? I don't know. Down below, you see that I had created a true-false variable. True-false makes the most sense right here because we're evaluating is something true or false? Is something visited true or false, right? Is it visited? Yes, true. Is it visited? No, false? Okay, cool. So that binary option makes a lot more sense. False is by default, meaning that as soon as you reach the slide, you don't need to of course it's false. You don't need to do anything because it hasn't been clicked. So our default value is false. When you click it, we'll change it from false to true. The reason this has a high use count is that I use the same 3 variables on the remaining slides. If you do that, then you're going to have to reset the value each time at the beginning of the timeline. I'll show you that a little toward the end. So that's why those use counts are so high, is that I've used this on 3 or 4 slides. Okay, so I created the 3 true false variables. Each time we click one of the buttons, we are basically adjusting that variable. So if I pop open this trigger, thankfully action adjust variable is one of our options. So you'll see that down here at the very bottom under more, and adjust variable simply means set or change the value of a variable. So we're saying set complete marker equal to true when you click marker. That's awesome, right? As soon as you click each one, it's true. Doesn't matter, again, which order the learner clicks in, because each of these is just changing the value to true for each. How do we evaluate this then? Well, that's what we need to go back to the base layer for. So I'm going to go ahead and save and close right here. And we have one big trigger right here that says, go ahead and change the state of the next button being the player's next button, when variable changes. And you could choose any one of these 3 variables, right? I need to evaluate when one of these has changed, because the power of this trigger right here all happens in the conditions. We have to have all 3 of these conditions as true in order for this to work. So basically what Storyline starts doing is tracking or evaluating once this first variable has been changed. But we could make that marker 3. It's not going to matter, because as soon as marker 3 changes, Storyline's going to see if all of those other ones have also been adjusted. But by evaluating the condition, then we can know or tell Storyline what to do when all of the markers have been true. So we'll go ahead and pop open this one right here. And now we're using this new variables. So we have all 3 of these that just put them in top to bottom, completion marker 1, completion marker 2, and completion marker 3. It won't matter which order we go in. Our next button is still disabled. And then upon all 3 of these being true, ta-da! There's our next button ready for action. Cool, right? So that's how you can begin working with your own variables to make things happen. So let's look at something else that we can do here. So I really like this next one, and that is we're going to add a trigger to the 4th marker, but it's only going to work when all other markers have been visited. Now, how do we do that? I'm using the same three variables that we used before. So we're saying when you click each one of these, set complete marker to 1, complete marker to 2, and 3. However, on this 4th marker, the next button marker, we have a couple of different triggers. So the second trigger is saying, go ahead and jump to the next slide when you click the next slide. Next slide is the marker called next slide, if all 3 of these variables are true. So just like we did with the base layer last time to set the next button to normal, we're doing the same thing here. It only will go to the next slide if all 3 of those variables are true. Let's say you click the button before it's true. That's why we have this first trigger right in front of it. So we're saying show a layer called alert. So I'll show you that layer in a moment. Show the layer alert if only one of these is false. So we're saying if marker 1's false, or this is a little different sometimes. We usually use and with the conditions, at least most of the time. This time we're using or. So if any one of these is false, you're not going forward. We're showing you the layer. So that's how we can prevent the learner from clicking this button and moving forward. So where does the layer come from? Just going to click save and close. And whoops, my layers are collapsed. Here's the alert layer, and it's just telling the learner to click all markers before moving forward. This button right here just says hide the layer, which means when we hide it, we're right back here in our 360-degree image. So let's take a look at that this time. So again, this is, okay, now it changed back to false because I did have a trigger on the slide master to reset everything to false. So that's why it went from true to false real quick. Okay, so you have 3 of these that we have to be clicked. I click 1, the second one is true, third one is true. Let's say the learner decides I want to move forward. Nope, because all 3 of those values are not true. They see an image, and we could gray out or prevent the learner from clicking on the base layer. All of those are possible. Return to image, click this last button, and now we can move forward to the last slide. Pretty cool, right? Okay, so let's look at one more and then we will wrap this up. So in this case, we have variables to track the completion, and then it's going to show a layer. So similar to what we did before with the slide layer, we're going to have an extra layer called complete, telling the learner they've completed everything. Go ahead and click next, and they can move forward. That should have a next trigger that says jump to live when user clicks. Cool. All right, I'm going to come back down to the base layer, and let's look at what we've set up with the markers, and then we'll look at the triggers on the base layer. So same thing we've been doing. Each of these markers has a simple trigger that's just adjusting the variable to true. So marker 3 equals true, marker 2 equals true, and marker 1 equals true. The magic is happening down here with this trigger, and it's just like pretty much what we've seen, just a variation of it. We're saying show the layer complete when the variable changes. And again, any one of those variables can change, but we'll show the layer only if all 3 of these markers is set to true. Now, I get that if you're brand new to 360-degree images, you probably think when you're in here, you want to see a layer, right? We're sort of inside this instance of the 360-degree image, so we don't see our layers right here. But this is really just like any other image on your slide in the sense that objects can be placed above or below it. We just don't see the layers. So my typical workflow would be first to create the layers, first to create that layer, right, that I know that I need to show, right? And then I would jump into my image, my 360-degree image. And then if I have anything in here like show a layer, that's when I would add the trigger for showing that layer. So it's like you're kind of going back and forth between the two. I know that it might take a couple of projects just to get used to, but when you're in the image, you're controlling objects for the image, but you can also save and close. You can also trigger and communicate with objects outside of the image on the slide layer, just like you would any other type of project. All right, last thing I wanted to show was just the slide master real quick. If I were building this project for a customer, I would probably create separate markers for each of the slide, but because I didn't want to have too many, separate variables for each of the interactions, I just didn't want to have that many, and I was being lazy. So what I'm doing here is setting the markers back to false each time the slide loads, and because all the slides are using the same timeline, it gets reset each time the timeline starts. So even if I come back over here, right, and I've already clicked all of these are all false, which could present a problem because now you see that the next button is set to disabled. And how are we going to get that all enabled again? Well, I've got to go back and click each of these and make that happen, but I would also need to refresh this slide coming back. So I wouldn't do this way in a real project, but it makes it easy to test it because then I don't have to go in and just overload this with create a bunch of extra variables. Hope this helpful. There's a lot more we can do. There's a lot of features being worked on and added to make these even better. If you have any comments or feedback, just jump in the forums and eLearning Heroes. You can even put attention Dave in the subject line. Love to know what you're working on, what you are creating, or if you have any stocks or questions, let me know and we'll be happy to help you out.